What's up, everybody? I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I had a thing that went down a while back here that I thought was socially fascinating. It says something about shifts that are happening in the world, but it also was a little bit of a shift for me in my brain. So a little background here. I was raised in a very not boozy family. My dad was and is a teetotaler. Mom's the same way. They don't have any judgment for anybody who likes beer. None at all. They're very cool. It's just not their thing and never became their thing. All right. So I grew up that way, and I just didn't think about alcohol much one way or the other. I didn't look at my friends who would drink in high school and stuff and be like, I wish I could be like them. And I also didn't look at them and think, they're terrible people. I don't know. I just didn't think about it. It wasn't on my radar. It was so removed from my growing up experience. Well, of course you get into your 20s and 30s and you're like, okay, well, that's something people do. And you try a wine here with a meal or a craft beer that somebody likes there. And maybe some of it is interesting. Maybe some of it's not very interesting. I'm not a great beer or wine guy, though I appreciate and respect the craft and occasionally have enjoyed what people have put in front of me. So at any rate, I go to the local watering hole in Lander, Wyoming one time. This is a really neat, really diverse, historic place. It's a microcosm of what makes Lander cool. Any given day, about half the people at this place are going to be wearing Cool and Prana and Columbia and probably skewing a little bit left, while the other half of the room on any given day is going to be wearing Carhartts and they're going to skew a little right. They're going to be more the ranching ATV, go shoot guns crowd, and everybody gets along. It works just fine. It's a picture of how life could be together. And so I ordered some food there one time with some friends, and I got a Mountain Dew. I usually do a Coke or a Mountain Dew or a water, occasionally maybe something more creative, but whatever. I just didn't think about it at all. And so I'm drinking my Mountain Dew, and we, as is always the case there, we see some people walk by and we wave and talk with them. And then another group of friends grabs a table and we banter back and forth with them while we're eating at our table. It's just a lot of fun. Don't think anything of it. Great meal. That's great. I enjoyed everything. Bye, everybody. And then about a week goes by, and this dude hits me up who is a little bit more of the younger, maybe a little bit socially more left crowd. I don't know. He's hard to place. But whatever the case, he's like, hey, I just wanted to tell you that I really respect you. I thought, well, I mean, you never hate hearing that. Okay, man. And he goes on. He's like, the other day you're hanging out with a bunch of people, and he's like, well, just about everybody you were sitting there with knows what soda does to a person's body, that it's just absolutely horrible for you and probably not a thing for people to drink. But I like that you were just trying to make everybody comfortable. And so you were willing to have one sitting right there with you the whole time and even took a few drinks. I saw what you did and I thought it was cool. And that's all I wanted to say. And I couldn't even respond. I was like, wait, what? Wait, no, what? You broke my mental social calculator. Here's what he meant. He was talking about me drinking a soda the way people in the 90s would talk about the person who's trying to be cool to everybody else and therefore carrying around a beer that they barely work on at all at a party. The whole moral social equation was so opposite for him of what my moral social equation was growing up that he was astounded that I would have a Mountain Dew with people in public, but he could only assume and give me the benefit of the doubt that I was doing it to be clever and strategic to try to make other people feel comfortable and help them out. But the biggest thing I took with me from this lengthy story I'm sharing with you is that there was a cultural flipping of the notions of clean and unclean that I was witnessing unfolding right before my eyes. Now, I know we think of clean and unclean as a very ancient, very biblical idea, but as you and I have discussed before, clean and unclean is a concept everybody has. You have it in your brain. There are certain things that somebody could pick up and put in their mouth and take a bite of, and you'd be like, yeah, sure, okay, whatever. And other things that you would be like, you cannot do, you couldn't really say why it's bad or disgusting or horrible, but that shared cultural or subcultural revulsion to something, whether there's a medical rationale for it being revolting or not, is part of this clean and unclean mentality that every society shapes and forms and takes with them. And again, here we are seeing a pivot in that, at least in that little microculture that I was a part of. Likewise, in Matthew chapter 15, Jesus is having that kind of jaw-dropping conversation with the crowds, not specifically the people he's arguing with, not the religious leaders, but the people who are witnessing the debate. Here's what I'm talking about. In Matthew 15, you've got some very fancy Pharisees and teachers of the law who come up north from Jerusalem. They have a confrontation with Jesus about hand washing. They're upset that Jesus' disciples don't do the ceremonial hand washing. They're concerned that maybe some Gentile dust or unclean animal dust got on their hands, and then when they eat, they might accidentally make themselves ceremonially unclean, and that'd be a problem, and then maybe all of society would collapse upon itself. And then Jesus fires right back, pointing out their hypocrisy. Then he cites the prophet Isaiah saying, basically, y'all are hypocrites. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. Then, and this is where we pick it up in verse 10, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen and understand, what goes into a man's mouth doesn't make him unclean. What comes out of his mouth, that's what makes him unclean. And before we start breaking down what that actually means, I want to acknowledge that there's some interesting stuff happening here narratively. Jesus isn't talking to the religious leaders anymore. So we're all in this big place. There's a lot of people around. You got, again, the three groups represented, the people who are really in with Jesus, the squishy middle crowds who are just still trying to size it up, and then you got the people who are angry at Jesus and who reject him. This exchange happens with the people who reject him, but the crowds and the people who are in are sitting there listening. Jesus calls them over to himself. I assume the Pharisees can still hear what's being said. But in the very act of boxing out the religious leaders and calling the crowds back to himself, we see that Jesus is saying, I know who you guys are who reject me. I know why you're rejecting me. I'm not going to go beat down the doors of your minds and hearts to win this argument. I'm going right back to the squishy middle. So we learn something about his strategy. That is pretty shrewd as serpent, innocent as doves kind of move to carry out there. But now that he has the crowd's attention, he gives them not a crystal clear teaching, also not a parable. It's a little bit cryptic. But this little bit cryptic teaching, it should be understandable, right? It's not what goes into you that makes you unclean, but it's what comes out of you that makes you unclean. It is interesting to me that he doesn't flesh this thing out any further. And because he doesn't flesh this thing out any further, I think what we're witnessing here is another one of those eyes to see, ears to hear kind of moments. And tomorrow we're going to look at the disciples coming up and being like, hey, do you know that you offended those religious leaders big time? And then Jesus is going to unpack the idea more. So we will as well. But let's just play along with the point of view of the crowds who only have up through Matthew 15:11, this little teaching to operate on. How would you take it? Well, if I'm in their shoes, I'm taking it the same way I'm taking that conversation at Gannett Grill. Like, whoa, you are saying that what I think about clean and unclean, something I haven't revisited in any way in my brain since I was a kid, you're saying that is flipped and that it's actually the opposite of what I assume. That in the same way my friend was suggesting that now the socially unclean thing to do was to drink a heavily sugared soda as opposed to a beer, that likewise Jesus is saying that uncleanness is not achieved by accidentally putting some crumb or morsel or fleck of dust you didn't account for that came off of something unclean into your body, but that rather the uncleanness is within you. You are what makes the uncleanness. And when you open your mouth and say things that are so obviously opposed to the character and the work of God, like Jesus called out in the previous passage with these guys, that is what is really, truly unclean. Now, again, that's just me trying to game it out with what we have in front of us and what the crowd would have had in front of them. We got more to go in the coming verses, and I assume that will be clarifying. Whatever we ultimately determine Jesus specifically means here, I think I can say this with confidence. That little phrase that he uttered to the crowds right there is revolutionary. It's gigantic. Nobody would have said stuff like this. He was challenging one of the most deeply held things that you, me, or anybody, any society has, and that is taboos. That is our notions of what is gross and icky, and what makes you gross and icky and have cooties, and what makes you clean and not gross and icky. Think about how visceral those beliefs that you hold are. Why don't you eat a house cat? I don't know. You don't eat house cats. That's horrible. My cultural set of norms and your cultural set of norms when it comes to the ideas of clean and unclean are some of the strangest yet most deeply held sets of beliefs that we have. And I would encourage you, my friend, turn this thing off when we're done, then talk with somebody about it. Bounce the question off of somebody. Think it through for yourself. I think you will see that what I'm saying is true. And if you can understand how bothersome it would be to have someone challenge one of those rooted in nothing notions of clean and unclean that you hold to and you don't really know why and you can't really defend, then you can imagine how shocking this would be when there actually is some religious grounding for why these people hold these notions of clean and unclean. Last thing, I want to say thanks to everybody who has taken a minute to review the podcast. That is a gigantic deal. I continue to read those. Like I've told you before, it would seem that every time even one of you leaves some kind of review, the result is that the podcast ends up in front of a whole bunch of new people. Just with the way the different podcast apps work, they see that there's interest in the form of reviews, and they're like, well, if people are reviewing it and there's interest, then let's put it on this little list of recommendeds or that little list of recommendeds. So I cannot tell you enough how much I appreciate that and how much it really genuinely helps. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for being here. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.